When God created man, put him in the garden, he looked at man there and he said, it's not good that man should be alone. I'll make a helper for him. So from his rib he took and made woman. And when he brought the woman to the man, we have in Genesis 2 verse 24 the definitive verse about what marriage is. A man shall leave his father and his mother, shall hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The importance of that statement, that they become one flesh, is, I think, emphasized by Jesus, because when he was dealing with the attitude of divorce that the Scribes and the Pharisees had, he restated not only this verse, but he said, what God has joined together, let not man separate. It's a bond that is intended to last a lifetime. In the book of Malachi, however, the people of God began divorcing their wives. And we can read about how that happened in Ezra and in Nehemiah. But Malachi is the prophet that's sent by God to rebuke the people for how they're treating their wives, the men for how they're treating their wives. And the essence of the problem is that of faithlessness. I want to start reading with you in verse 10, Malachi chapter 2, verse 10. Have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us? Why then are we faithless to one another, profaning the covenant of our fathers? Judah has been faithless. An abomination has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. For Judah has profaned the sanctuary of Jehovah, which he loves, and has married the daughter of a foreign god. May Jehovah cut off from the tents of Jacob and any descendants of man who does this, who brings an offering to Jehovah of hosts. And this is the second thing you do. You cover Jehovah's altar with tears, with weeping, with groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. But you say, why does he not? Because Jehovah was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Did he not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what has the one God seeking godly offspring? So guard yourselves in the Spirit, and let none of you be faithless to the wife of his youth. For the man who does not love his wife, but divorces her, says Jehovah, the God of Israel, covers his garment with violence, says Jehovah of hosts. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and do not be faithless. I don't know if you noticed, there's a word that runs through that passage, faithlessness. Well, it's faithless, but I'm making the noun out of it, right? Faithlessness. The Israelites had been faithless to God, and he points out how they had gone after other gods, and instead of being united as one people with him, they were off worshiping idols. He emphasizes that even though they were bringing gifts to the altar, they were worshiping God, God didn't accept their gifts. He didn't accept their gifts because not only because they had been faithless in their relationship with him, but because they had been faithless in their marriage relationships. What God said should be one relationship, they had changed. I love in verse 14 how he describes the marriage relationship, don't you? In Genesis 2, we're told that the wife is to be a helper who is fit for a wife, a helper who corresponds to the wife. And that's a beautiful picture of a mutually submissive and a mutually working relationship. Now he uses the expression companion. So she's not just a helper in the sense that when my boys were little and I needed to work on the car, they handed me the tools. Hand me a screwdriver, hand me this wrench. It wasn't that kind of just helper that God ever intended the wife to be. She's a companion. Someone who gives you the help you need so that you don't feel alone, the help that is necessary. And she's your wife by covenant. That's the other word that's used. She's your wife by covenant. There's an agreement been made. That's what the marriage vows are all about, that covenant relationship. And did you notice in verse 15, he says, your wife as a companion and a covenant. Verse 15 says, did he not make them one? God makes us one flesh. It's not the saying of the vows in and of themselves. It's God's part in the marriage that he makes the husband and the wife into one. He joins us together. What a powerful statement that is, that he does that for us. The problem with these people is that they had been faithless. Faithless to their wives. They had divorced their wives and had married younger women and gone on to other people. The word faithless in this translation, depending on your translation, you might see the word treacherous. You might see the word betrayed. There's an element of deceit in this word, that you've made a promise and that you don't keep it. So there's definitely deceit. There's the idea of one who doesn't honor an agreement that has been made. Faithlessness. And it was destroying not only the relationships between the husbands and the wives, but also their relationship with God. That's a powerful thing, faithlessness is. There was a time, even in our society, when adultery and divorce were spoken of as shameful things. We spoke of them in whispers. We didn't talk about it with our children. It was something that was unknown, practically. But we've accepted fornication, sex outside of marriage. In fact, in the media, it's encouraged and propagated. It's considered normal. Adultery is considered normal also and expected. Divorce is practically inevitable if you talk to most people. We even have an expression sometimes people will throw out there. Promises are made to be broken. That just breaks my heart, doesn't it? Because it hurts to hear something like that. The very idea of a lifelong marriage is disparaged in our society as being unreasonable and unnatural. And as a society, we've taught our children that faithlessness is okay. It's no wonder that we see relationships in this world crumbling. Turn over a few pages to the book of Matthew, the 5th chapter. Matthew, the 5th chapter is the Sermon on the Mount, and we're looking today at the second example that Jesus gives us of what true righteousness is about. As you recall, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is telling us and teaching us what it means to be a citizen in the kingdom of heaven. He's described the character and the beatitude, the 8 attributes that we've looked at. He's told the Jews at that time, he says, that your righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of the Scribes and the Pharisees. And then he's giving us 5 examples of that. The first one had to do with murder and anger. And the second one has to do with adultery and divorce. Let's read beginning of verse 27. Matthew 5, beginning of verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. It is also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So here we have, as we talked about when we did murder last week, we have to remind ourselves of what the law that was given to Moses actually says. And that we find in Exodus 20 chapter, listed among the commandments. Doesn't it seem so clear? You shall not commit adultery. How could this possibly be misconstrued? How could it be possibly misunderstood what that means? And yet the scribes and the Pharisees had. One of the warnings Jesus had given the scribes and the Pharisees was that they were not to relax the commandments that were in the kingdom. So the question maybe we could put more clearly is, how have the scribes and the Pharisees relaxed this commandment, you shall not commit adultery? Well, he says that what they had heard been taught, and I think this is a misinference of the scribes and the Pharisees, they say you shall not commit adultery. Okay, that sounds exactly the same, right? There's a little bit of thought that we have to put into it with the things that Jesus says later about what they were teaching. But the essence of the idea is that the scribes and the Pharisees were essentially saying it's okay to look lustfully at a woman as long as you don't do anything about it. So to look in this passage means to gaze, to gaze at. To lust, of course, is that desire in the heart. And so this was essentially saying that as long as you don't commit the actual act of adultery, it's okay for you to look at a woman in such a way that you desire to possess her in a physical way. That's astonishing to me. And yet, that's not unusual. Even as a young man, I was told by married men, it's okay for me to look at the menu as long as I don't eat. They were talking about sexual immorality. That's something that stuck in my head, and I wish it hadn't have. Because it's not okay to do that. You have to realize that what the scribes and the Pharisees were doing was they were essentially approving of sinfulness. They were calling that which was evil good, just like Isaiah had prophesied of them in Isaiah the 5th chapter and verse 20, that they would call evil good. They were doing exactly that. Their attitude toward adultery was interesting. Remember the prayer of the Pharisee who stands up in the temple and he prays by himself with God, and he says, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even this tax collector. So they obviously looked at those who committed adultery with a bad intent, but their attitude was odd. We can see that in John the 8th chapter. When the scribes and the Pharisees catch a woman in the act of adultery, and they choose to use her to test Jesus, instead of helping her, instead of bringing her back to God, instead of trying to help her deal with whatever was in this situation, they use her as a tool to try to trap Jesus. They bring her to him and say, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses, it commands us to stone the woman. What do you say? Did they care about the sin? Did they care about this woman? Were they being like God in any way? No, we see that Jesus dealt with them beautifully in correcting their attitude, but he also deals with her. And the way that he deals with her is after the men have all left, he says to her, is anyone left to accuse you? She says, no one, Lord. And what is his response? Neither do I accuse you. Go and sin no more. The witnesses were gone. But he was concerned about her life, and her relationship with God, not like them. The Pharisees had this attitude about adultery. They had made it easy to not commit the actual act, and yet fail to understand the intent of you shall not commit adultery. And so I think Jesus clearly points out the hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees in this passage. They condemned it, yet they didn't help the people to avoid it, to overcome it, or to be reconciled to God as they should. Jesus says, in contrast to you shall not commit adultery, Jesus says, as a divine answer, but I say to you, as the lawgiver explaining the law, but I say to you, everyone who looks on a woman with lustful intent has committed adultery with her in his heart. This key passage is really important to me because it's what forms my understanding of all 5 of these examples in Matthew 5. That what Jesus is really getting at in explaining the problems is the problem we have inside of us. Who I am inside. Am I more like the world or am I like God? Who am I truly following in my life? And he says the problem with adultery is not just the physical act of adultery, but it's the lust that is behind the adultery. that says, I desire someone who is not my wife. Jesus is trying to help us understand that you shall not commit adultery has a deeper understanding, and it was about lust. That's what God was trying to help us to deal with, not just the physical thing, but so much more about how I think about a woman, about how I think about other people. How do I deal with those desires? Now, certainly, Jesus is emphasizing the purity that the law points us to. And the Pharisees had conveniently narrowed down the definition of sexual sin and broadened the idea of sexual purity so that they could think of themselves as being righteous while they were engaging in sin. Highly respectable men and women, by Jesus' definition. All of us struggle with this to some extent. While we might never touch a woman, to look on someone and enjoy that thought in a sinful way in our imagination, that's a difficult thing. Who of us is not guilty of adultery in that sense? It's a great struggle. It reminds me of Job when he was defending his integrity against those who accused him. One of his statements in the 31st chapter in verse 1 is that I've made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? Do you notice he doesn't say I made a covenant with my wife that I wouldn't look? He said I made a covenant with my eyes. He knew it was about his heart, about who he was deep inside. And he refused to break that covenant with his eyes. Who's that covenant really with? We know, don't we? I'm not even going to look at that young girl in such a way. Now, how can this be applied spiritually? Because isn't that what he's trying to get us to? If you turn with me over to the book of Hosea. Hosea is prophet to the people of Israel, the northern 10 tribes. And as you recall, they were never very faithful to God in any sense as a nation. And Hosea becomes, with his wife Gomer, an example of an adulterous relationship that God uses to describe his relationship with the people of Israel. And I just want to pick out a couple of verses very quickly, but in Hosea, the 2nd chapter, verse 2, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. God is using the adultery that happened in Hosea and Gomer's relationship as the adultery between Israel and God, and they were going after other gods. In fact, that picture is seen clearly in verse 5. For their mother has played the whore. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my bread and my water, my wool, my flax, my oil, and my drink. You see how they had adulterated themselves? They were completely faithless with God. And they were actually claiming that these other false gods were the ones sustaining them. So it's not surprising by the time we get to the 4th chapter in verse 10, we see God's attitude. Hosea, the 4th chapter in verse 10. They shall eat and not be satisfied. They shall play the whore, but not multiply, because they have forsaken Jehovah. That's a key phrase. They've forsaken Jehovah. To cherish whoredom, wine, and new wine, which take away the understanding. My people inquire of a piece of wood, and their walking staff gives them oracles. For a spirit of whoredom has led them astray, and they have left their God to play the whore. They sacrifice on the tops of the mountains and burn offerings on the hills under oak, poplar, or terebinth, because their shade is good. Therefore, your daughters play the whore, and your brides commit adultery. Can we be guilty, just like Israel, of whoring after other gods? For most of us, the problem is not that we are going to go up onto a hill and offer a burnt offering, or that we're going to go out and cut down a tree and make an idol and bow down to the idol. But do we not have false gods in our lives? Can we be faithless to our God just like they were? These people were looking at the gods of the other nations and wishing that they could do as those gods. It would be like us, maybe to some extent, appreciating how those others are allowed to sin, and it's okay. If I chose to follow after the Norse gods, then for the most part, fighting and killing and drinking and fornication are all okay. What is the key thought that Jesus is trying to get us at here? Don't forsake Jehovah. Be faithful. Just like marriage is intended to be one flesh, our relationship with God is to be, I am his person, he is my God. Go back to Matthew. And Jesus tells us very clearly the seriousness of this situation. When he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, then chop it off. Because it's better to go maimed than to go to hell. Even things of great value should be given up if they lead a person to sin. I don't believe, in any sense, Jesus is encouraging self-mutilation in this passage. Because I believe a blind man can still lust. And a man with only one hand can still touch what he should not touch. So we need to understand there's a hyperbole here. He's trying to tell us that ultimately the problem is in our heart, isn't it? This passage underscores the very real and very horrible nature of sin. And the danger that sin leads to, which is hell. It tells us that we need to be very conscious of the importance of the soul. Jesus Christ died so that we could be set free from sin. We could have hope and eternal life. But sin can pull us away. What does man profit if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? And so we have to, even as those who follow Christ, we have to deal with sin. We have to get rid of it in our lives. And we're to deal drastically with sin if that's what we need to do. Don't pamper sin. Don't flirt with sin. Hate it. Crush it. Dig it out. Paul in Colossians said, put it to death. In Romans, he said, if you live by the Spirit, put to death the deeds of the body. Then you'll live. In 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, he said, I discipline my body and keep it under control. Don't let your flesh rule over your spirit. If you're God's child, that needs to be the spirit inside you. Live by it. And so that means sometimes we have to eliminate things from our lives. Things that may be innocent in and of themselves. But if they're sources of temptation, it needs to be ended. If the most precious thing in your life tempts you to sin, get rid of it. Don't ever feed the flesh. Deliberately restrain it. Remember the price that was paid on the cross. The second thing that Jesus deals with in this passage in Matthew the 5th chapter is divorce. And there is a sense for what the Jews were doing at that time, in which divorce was a very insidious form of adultery. They used it as a way to violate God's law by their teaching. So he deals with our proclivity for divorce. Now, let's go back for a moment. The law taught, if you go back to Deuteronomy, the 24th chapter, verse 1, when a man takes a wife and he marries her, if he finds no favor in her eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house and she departs. That's what the law said. Now, the rest of that passage goes on to give other regulations about not coming back. But for now, that's the essence of the law. Jesus, by the way, the word indecency in this passage has to do with nakedness, nudity, and therefore that which is shameful. So it has to do with any indecent or improper behavior. It's used in the book of Leviticus 18 times, always about sexual relationships. So in my mind, there's no doubt that indecency is talking about sexual things. One commentator said the equivalent of some indecency is our cliche, caught with your pants down. And I think that captures it. You've shown everyone. That's what's shameful. Now, what the Pharisees did, the Scribes and the Pharisees, the way that they said that was, sadly, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Do you note the omission of something? Because I do. The law said, if you find some indecency in her, and they omitted it. And really not just omitted it, but they redefined it to mean just about anything that the husband didn't like. You can read some of the old commentaries that they had at that time. One man defined indecency as a woman who doesn't cook a meal the way that you like. So if a man finds some indecency in his wife, and classic example is burn my toast, out you go. Do you think that was God's intent in Deuteronomy 24? I don't think that comes close to what he intended. The Pharisees made the most important aspect of divorce that you get the writing of certificate. That was the most important. Whatever reason you have for getting rid of your wife, you give her that certificate. Is that a misunderstanding of Deuteronomy 24? Oh, it's a horrible misunderstanding, isn't it? Divorce was made easy and simple by the Scribes and the Pharisees. We always have to remember this exception existed. Jesus tells us in Matthew 19. For what reason? For the hardness of their hearts. Not because they were trying to be like Jesus, but because they were trying to be like the world. Divorce, in most instances, is an insidious form of adultery. The Pharisees were guilty of adultery in two ways that they didn't see. One was the lust in the hearts, and the second was divorce, and they thought they were righteous. What is Jesus advocating, reminding us of in this passage? He's reminding us of the permanence of marriage, that God intended that we would be one, and we should avoid divorce. If divorce is for any reason other than fornication, then there's a problem, adultery or lust. Why the exception does he give in this passage? I think Paul in 1 Corinthians makes that really clear. Paul in 1 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, says this. And we're going to look at just a couple of verses real quick. But in verse 12, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for the food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body, this is what we need to listen to, the body is not meant for sexual immorality. The Scribes and the Pharisees had tried to find ways around that. That's a clear statement. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And then he helps us understand why this is so important. Skip down to verse 16. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For it is written, the two shall become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. When there's something different about the sexual sins. And I think it has a lot to do with faithlessness, don't you? Flee from it, he says, because when you do this sin, you're sinning against your own body. If all we learn from Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5, if all we learn from this is that, well, I should not commit adultery, and I shouldn't lust, and I shouldn't divorce, and I need to take drastic action to deal with sin, we're as blind and deceived as the Pharisees.
Amen.
What is the underlying principle in this passage? What is it teaching us? What is God teaching us about himself? For me, the answer is God is faithful. God is faithful, and he expects us to be a faithful people, both in our marriages and in our relationship with him. This is something that he talked about very clearly over and over again. In the book of Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 3 times Paul said to the people, God is faithful. One of them was in that very famous passage about when we're tempted, God is faithful and will always provide the way of escape. We know we can trust God. He's going to do what he promises, what he says he's going to do. In Exodus, the 34th chapter, when Moses asks to see the glory of God, and God passes before him and declares his glory, one of the qualities that he mentions among those things when he says, Jehovah, Jehovah, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Our God is a God who is faithful. Look in Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter. And in verse 4, if I can find it. Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter, and verse 4. Speaking of God, it says, the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. Our God is a God who is faithful. I think underlying the law that says do not commit adultery is an understanding that we are to be faithful. And we are to have the same character as God, to be faithful. Now, the sad thing is I'm out of time for today. Okay? But just so you know, what we'll do next week is we're going to talk about how we demonstrate faithfulness in our marriage and how we demonstrate faithfulness to our God. I think this is a very important aspect of the lesson because too often when we talk about adultery, it's just, well, we end up kind of being like the Scribes and the Pharisees. Well, I haven't done anything wrong. And there's more to being faithful than just avoiding the wrong. There's making sure that my partner knows that I am faithful. And how can I show my partner that I am faithful to them? So that in their mind, there is no doubt about our relationship. And that's what we'll talk about next week. So next week, a lesson on marriage, basically, is what we're going to end up with. But I hope this has helped you to understand. I think the very key issue that Jesus is dealing with in Matthew 5 is not just don't commit adultery, but be faithful because I am faithful. And he expects that in every aspect of our lives. I appreciate your patience and your thoughts this morning as we open God's Word. I pray that you'll open your Bibles and study it and think about it. Help me to understand it better if I've said something that was inappropriate or wrong. If there's anyone here this